Okay, ready to dive in. We're looking at this study about genes and how they change after a mild traumatic brain injury in pigs.
Yeah, it's like peering into the microscopic world of a concussion.
It is, it is. So why pigs, though? What makes them such great candidates for this type of research?
Well, their brains, believe it or not, are surprisingly similar to ours.
Really?
In what ways? Well, you know those folds in the brain, like the gyrria and sulci?
Yeah.
Pigs have those too. And they're structured in a similar way, meaning they have that same complexity that our brains do.
Huh. Makes sense, then, why they'd be chosen for this.
Hmm.
So how do they actually mimic a concussion in these pigs? Did they, bonk them on the head?
No bonking involved. They actually used a special model to create those rotational forces that often cause concussions.
So, the kind of force you'd experience in a car accident or a sports injury, where your head suddenly twists or jerks?
Exactly. And it's a closed head model, too, so no skull cracking needed. It's a much more realistic way to study the kind of concussions that, most people experience.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're looking at gene expression at 3 points, 3 days, 30 days, and then a whole year after the injury.
Right.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar with gene expression, can you just give us a little breakdown of what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we're talking about which genes are turned on or off after that injury. And that can give us really important clues about how the brain's responding on a molecular level.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. So what did they find? What happened in those pig brains after a concussion?
Well, the first big surprise was at that 3-day mark.
Oh.
Yeah, they found 11 genes that had changed significantly. One of the most interesting was SYT1.
Okay, SYT1.
I'm all ears. So SYT1, it plays a really crucial role in how brain cells communicate. It helps with the release of neurotransmitters.
Right, the brain's chemical messengers.
Yes, exactly. And they found that it was downregulated after the injury, which suggests that there's some disruption in those communication pathways.
So basically, some brain cells are having trouble getting their messages across.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And, that could potentially explain some of the symptoms we see after a concussion, like, difficulty concentrating or memory problems.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So were there any other gene changes that really stood out to the researchers?
Yeah, there was another one that's pretty intriguing. It's called SORL1, and it's been linked to Alzheimer's disease.
Alzheimer's. Wait, so even a mild concussion could increase someone's risk of developing that later on?
Well, it's too early to say for sure, but it's definitely a finding that raises some eyebrows. And what's particularly interesting is that this gene was upregulated, meaning it was more active after the concussion.
Okay. So we've got one gene that's downregulated, potentially leading to those immediate symptoms we talked about, and another that's upregulated, possibly raising the risk of problems down the line.
Exactly. It really highlights the complexity of what's happening in the brain after an injury like this.
Okay, so before we spiral into worry about Alzheimer's, were there any positive gene changes they observed?
There was one. NF1. It's a gene that typically protects the brain. And in this study, they found that it was upregulated after the injury.
So that's like the brain's trying to fight back, right?
Exactly. It's trying to repair the damage, and it just really highlights the brain's resilience.
It's good to hear. There's at least some good news in all of this. So we've got these really interesting gene changes happening at 3 days post-injury. What about at those later time points, like the 30-day mark and the 1-year mark? Did they see anything then?
That's where things get a little mysterious, actually. They didn't find any significant gene expression changes at those later time points.
So does that mean everything was back to normal, like the brain had fully recovered?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? It's certainly possible, but it's also possible that, there are more subtle changes happening that just weren't detected with this particular method.
So even though we don't see those big swings in gene expression, it doesn't necessarily mean everything's hunky-dory in the brain.
Right. I mean, think of it like this. When you throw a rock into a pond, you get those initial big waves.
Yeah.
But then, the ripples continue to spread out even after those initial waves have subsided.
Okay, I like that analogy. So we might not be seeing the big waves anymore, but there could still be these ripples of change happening beneath the surface.
Exactly. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2024-1021, part 2 of 3. It really makes you think twice about that whole shake it off mentality with concussions.
Right. Even if you're feeling better after a few weeks, there might be more going on that we don't fully understand yet.
Yeah, exactly. This study is really just a tiny peek into the world of brain injury, it raises more questions than it answers, you know?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But imagine if we could understand those long-term effects. Like, what if we could predict or even prevent those problems down the line?
Oh, that would be incredible, wouldn't it? If we could identify those subtle changes early on, we could maybe develop some targeted treatments to help the brain heal more effectively.
Yeah, instead of just managing symptoms, we could actually be addressing those underlying causes.
Exactly, exactly. It would be a total game changer. And this study is a really good first step toward that.
So speaking of the study, I think it's worth pointing out that they looked at whole sets of genes, not just individual ones. Can you explain why that's so important?
Yeah, sure. So looking at those sets of genes, it gives us a much broader view of how the brain's responding to the injury. It's not just about one gene going haywire. It's about how those genes are working together, you know?
I see, I see. So what kind of patterns did they see when they looked at these gene sets?
Well, at that 3-day mark, they noticed that 2 key processes were in overdrive: chromatin modification and autophagy.
Okay, quick refresher for our listeners. Chromatin modification, that's like changing the instructions in a cell's DNA, right?
Yeah.
And then autophagy, that's more like the cell's cleanup crew.
You got it. So essentially, the brain's doing some major reorganizing after a concussion. It's kind of like cleaning house and rearranging all the furniture.
Wow, that's a pretty intense process.
Yeah.
What about at the 30-day mark? Did they see any changes in those processes then?
At 30 days, they noticed a surge in activity related to cytokines.
Cytokines, remind me, those are like the brain's alarm bells, right? They signal inflammation.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though they didn't see those big gene expression changes at 30 days, this cytokine activity suggests that the brain is still dealing with the aftermath of that injury.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the initial shock might be over, but the brain's still kind of cleaning up the mess.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like those aftershocks after an earthquake. You know, the big one might be over, but there are still tremors happening beneath the surface.
I never thought about it that way before. That's a really good analogy. It all makes me wonder about the connection between those molecular changes we're talking about and the symptoms people actually experience after a concussion.
Right, right. Well, think about that downregulation of the SYT1 gene we talked about earlier, the one that's involved in how brain cells communicate. That disruption could be a major factor in those cognitive symptoms people often report after a concussion, like difficulty concentrating, memory problems, things like that.
So it's not just that they, hit their head, it's that their brain cells are actually struggling to talk to each other.
Precisely, precisely.
Yeah.
And then, that cytokine activity we talked about, that could help explain those feelings of fatigue and just overall malaise that are so common after a concussion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Inflammation anywhere in the body can make you feel wiped out. So it would stand to reason that the brain wouldn't be any different.
Exactly. It all starts to connect, doesn't it? The molecular changes, the symptoms, it really paints a picture of just how profoundly the brain is impacted by even a mild concussion.
It really does. And it just emphasizes how important it is to take concussions seriously, even if they seem minor at first.
Absolutely. And this is just one study, Imagine what we'll learn as this field of research continues to evolve. There's so much more to discover. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive, episode 2024-1021, part 3 of 3.
It's amazing, right? Like, we can actually see how genes change after a concussion. It's like we've got this new window into the brain.
It is. It is. And to think, we're using pig brains to help us understand human concussions.
It's incredible how far research has come.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes you realize that even what seems like a mild bump on the head can really have these lasting effects throughout the brain.
Absolutely. And it's not just about that initial impact, right? It's about those molecular changes that might be happening long after you feel better.
Which is why it's so crucial to take any concussion seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And, hopefully as research continues, we'll be able to develop even better ways to diagnose and treat these injuries.
I agree. This study is a great starting point, but there's still so much more to learn.
Imagine, like, a world where we could just do a simple blood test after a concussion and get a detailed readout of what's happening in the brain at a molecular level.
Oh, that would be revolutionary, wouldn't it? I mean, we could personalize treatment plans based on that information.
Yeah.
We could identify people who are at a higher risk of developing long-term problems.
Yeah, and maybe even intervene early enough to prevent those problems from ever happening.
Exactly. It would completely change how we approach concussion care.
It's really exciting to think about the possibilities. It's like we're on the verge of something big.
I think so, too. And, it all comes back to investing in research and supporting the scientists who are working tirelessly to unlock these mysteries of the brain.
This has been an amazing deep dive, honestly. I feel like I've learned so much about concussions, both how complex they are and how much potential there is for future discoveries.
I've really enjoyed chatting with you and our listeners about this too.
And, if anything, I hope this has made everyone realize just how incredible the brain is. It's resilient, it's adaptable, and it's definitely worth protecting.
Couldn't agree more. From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.